Today is a very special day in the life of our church. Today, we celebrate harvest. Traditionally, each year, around the beginning of October, our church and many others in the UK has a Harvest Sunday. I believe pre-COVID this was a harvest dinner, right? Am I correct there? Hopefully, Harvest Festival, thank you, that's the word I was looking for. Harvest Festival. Hopefully we'll get to go back to that next year. But whether a festival or just a service, this is to remind ourselves of what God has given us. And it's also to remind ourselves that there are others who are not as fortunate as ourselves. And that we need to be willing to give of our harvest to help those whose own harvests have been lacking. This year, though, we get to celebrate a double blessing. Along with the harvest of food, we are receiving new members into the church today. This was a service that was supposed to happen nearly 18 months ago, but was delayed for obvious reasons. So today, from seeds planted by this church, along with a harvest of food, we celebrate a harvest of souls as well. First, let's talk about the harvest of food. Most of my ministry took place in southern and central Indiana, part of the Midwest that's known as the breadbasket of America. So much of my ministry was to farmers. And I learned a lot from those farmers in those years. I think, in fact, that there is a lot of wisdom in farming that people don't think of. Farmers, after all, start out months before the harvest, back in the spring, preparing their seeds for planting. They sow it, they put it in the ground, they plant it, and then, if they've done everything right, then they get a perfect harvest. Correct? No. Unfortunately not. For all the advances that have been made in farming, it's still not an exact science. It doesn't matter how good a job you do at the front end, there's still a million factors in between. You can't control the rain. You can't control the sun or the wind. The farmer knows that after the seed goes in the ground, that it is in the hands of God. And they hope that there's enough water to water those crops without drowning them. They hope that there's enough sunshine to nourish those crops without drying them out. But there are a million factors that are out of their control. And so this idea of the harvest being a time for giving thanks is one that makes a lot of sense in the life of a farmer. Giving thanks not for the work that we have done, but for the blessing that God has given us in creating this food that we all get to enjoy. Our reading here in Deuteronomy this morning is addressed to a group of people that are just about to learn this for themselves. You see, these speeches at the end of Deuteronomy, these were given at the end of 40 years of wandering in the desert. And if you remember the story from the Old Testament, that people that were taken by God out of slavery into Egypt, they were being led finally into the promised land. But because of their lack of faith, their entry into that promised land had been delayed by 40 years. 40 years of wandering in the desert until an entire generation had passed away. The generation that had been born in Egypt, the generation that had known slavery, that generation that when they got to the wilderness, when they found that it was actually going to be a tough job of establishing the promised land, the generation that wanted to go back to Egypt, that would rather put themselves back into slavery rather than follow God's instructions. So 40 years after they left Egypt, 40 years of wandering in the desert. And during that time, they didn't plant for themselves. They didn't harvest for themselves. As a matter of fact, we're told that their primary source of food was something that was called manna, which was this bread, this food that God sent from the sky each night. And all they had to do was go around and pick it up during the day. We're told that their sources of water in the desert was God leading them to an oasis. And so for 40 years, every aspect of their lives was being cared for by God. And here they were finally coming upon a time when they were going to have their own land. A land of blessing, a land of bounty. The scripture tells us that it was a land where they would not lack bread, a land where they would have everything that they needed. And God knew his people. He knew that when they got into that land, when they began to plant those crops for themselves, when they began to work by the sweat of their own brow, when they begin to harvest the food with their own hands, he knew that there was going to be a temptation. A temptation for them to say, look what I did. I planted that seed. I weeded that field. I harvested that crop. God knew there was going to be a temptation for them to begin to take credits for these things. And so in our speech that Ryan shared with us this morning, we have a reminder to them to remember the things that God has given them. And so he gives them a couple of warnings here in this speech. The first was in verses 7 through 10. Remember that God brought you out of slavery and into an abundant land. As I said, God had led them into a land where bread was not going to be scarce, where they would have everything that they would need. And we have been given the same thing. Now, I don't know anything about the individual financial situations of anyone in this church. But I do know a few years ago I was doing research on this. And I found that the poorest person in my own country, the poorest person back in America, was still in the top 10% of the world's wealth. And I'm going to guess that that number is probably fairly similar here in the UK. I'm willing to guess that even as bad as the economy has gotten over the last few decades, that there are very few of us that have had to worry about how we will feed our children. We live in a land which is very blessed each and every day. And the temptation for us, just like those Israelites, the temptation is for us to say, look what we have done. Look at this country that we have built. Look at this food that I have put on my family's table with my own work. Look at this house that my family is able to live in because of the salary that I make. We too need to be reminded that everything we have is from God. God has given us this land. A land where we have enough food to eat, even when we don't have enough HGV drivers to deliver it all. Many places in the world, unfortunately, this isn't true. We live in a land where we have relative comfort with our families. A land where we can choose to worship or not worship as we please. God has given us all of this, and we need to remember that He has led us out of slavery. Not slavery to the Egyptians, but slavery to sin and death. He's led us out of that slavery, and He's blessed us with this church, this congregation, and this community. And we are now at the time of year where, in particular, we remember those blessings that God has given us. Finally, he tells them, that they need to remember with humility the history that they have with God. Now, as I said, most of those present when this speech was being given, they had no firsthand knowledge of the slavery that the people had endured in Egypt. That generation, with only a few exceptions, had all passed away. And so this was a generation that had grown up completely in the wilderness, that had grown up completely under God's care, that had grown up completely without the shadow of slavery hanging over them. So they were well acquainted with these provisions that God had given them. This manna, this water, this protection that he had provided during all the years of wandering in the desert. I remember back when I was in seminary, one of our preachers, Ronald Allen, he would tell a story about a sermon that he gave whenever he was visiting Africa. And he said that after the sermon, a missionary came up and introduced himself. This missionary was a doctor, and he'd been serving the last few years in this area of Africa where progressive blindness was a great problem. Many people there were born with normal sight, but there was something in the environment, maybe something in the water, something in the air. They began to lose their sight at a very early age. And a large population of this area was blind. And this doctor, he had come up with this technique, this surgery in which he could actually halt this progressive blindness. And so people came to him from all over the area. They would have this surgery performed, and they knew that when they left, that they had been freed. Freed from a life of blindness. Freed a life of stumbling around in the dark. And they knew that their blessing, their vision, was because of the blessings that this doctor had brought to them. But the doctor says, in their language, there is not a phrase that translates into English as thank you. He says it's not because it's a matter of ingratitude. He says because the words that they use, when you translate them literally into English, they are the words, I will speak your name. I will speak your name. I will remember what you have done for me. I will remember the blessings that you have given me, and everywhere I go, every person that I meet, I will tell them your name and the wonderful things that you have done. Everything that we have has been given to us by God. All our blessings, our provisions, our family and our friends. And yet, when we leave this place on Sunday morning, do we remember to tell people God's name? Do we remember to give him credit for the things that we have? Or are we all too ready to claim our items and our possessions as our own, to tell people that they can get theirs somewhere else? I will remember. I will speak your name wherever I go.